News. 11 officers shot, 4 tragically killed in Dallas, Texas tonight. This is supposedly retaliation for the police shootings that happened in Baton Rouge and Minnesota. This is a tragedy. This is going on right now, and we're going to bring you the story as it breaks. This is a special breaking news report. It's about 11:45 Eastern Time. And I'm telling you, man, I just pray for everybody to be safe. They have been talking about it back and forth down there in Baton Rouge that people was tired of turning the other cheek, that the shit was getting ready to hit the fan, man. I'm trying to tell y'all this is a coordinated plan that is deeper than you could ever imagine. As tragic as the two police shootings were the past 2 days with Alton Sterling and also the other gentleman down there. His name escapes me right now because this story is breaking. I'm watching it as it's going on. I'm going right on the news wire. It's all over CNN. Don Lemon's reporting it, which is also, a little suspect with the way the mainstream media is already coordinating the story. They're saying that there's 2 snipers on the loose in Dallas that are not in custody right now. So it's a very dangerous situation. I know we laugh and joke, always talking about conspiracies, but this really is going down right now because the president gave a speech a few hours ago live from Poland and Warsaw, Poland, which was around midnight his time, which was around 8 o'clock our time, Eastern time. And was basically talking about the shootings that happened, but also alluded to police shootings and how we mourn for police when things happen. And it just seems like it's very peculiar that you have 10 officers shot within hours of that speech in Dallas where neither one of these tragedies happened. So it just seems that there's something going on, and we'll see in the days to come. And for the weekend, I hope all of you people be safe, whether you're black, white, or green, but especially our African Americans and minorities and Hispanics. If your license ain't straight, if your stuff ain't straight, just stay off the streets and watch yourself, man. This is Fort Knox reporting live, Rapspiracy. I pray for all the people that's out there. Just be safe. Get your butt in the house. Stop trying to get all the Snapchats and all the footage. If you're not one of those official street journalists or have any type of media credentials, then get off the streets, man, because I'm telling you, the retaliation for this all across the country is going to be intense. It's Fort Knox signing off. If you subscribe to this channel, we're going to stay live on this. We might even be live streaming this tomorrow as some of the other aftermath goes on and the weekend comes and God knows what's going to happen. So just stay safe, keep your eyes open, and stay alert. Subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what you think, or as developments come on, we can conversate back and forth. And also hit me up on Twitter and Instagram at Rapspiracy. The website should be up in the next few days, but right now we just going straight to the people. Rapspiracy News signing off.
What was the Catalinarian conspiracy? Well, it was a plot to overthrow Rome. But first, some background. In 64 BC, Catiline, Cicero, Hybrida, and a few others reigned for consulship. But for the consulship, there can only be 2. Thus Cicero and Hybrida became consuls while Catiline came in third. This angered him, and he began to consider other avenues to power. Still, in 63 BC, he ran for the consulship again, but again he was defeated. This was partly due to Cicero's scare tactic of coming to the pole, wearing a breastplate under his toga and accompanied by an armed guard, an action historian Mary Beard in her book SBQR has likened to if a modern politician were to enter the legislature in a business suit with a machine gun slung over his shoulder. This did not help their relationship. Frustrated, Catiline decided that the only way to get power was revolution. A conspiracy formed around him. Several lucked-out politicians and disgruntled veterans joined Catiline's cause. The veteran Manlius started enrolling men for an army in Etruria, north of Rome. His plans progressed, but word started to get out. Forward to mid-October 63 BC. Ultra-rich nobleman Crassus and 2 others received letters warning them to leave Rome. They roused Cicero and presented these letters to him. He in turn used these to warn the Senate about the plot, and the Senate gave him emergency powers. On October 27th, Manlius went into open revolt. Small disturbances also began to occur around the country, but these were quickly extinguished. On November 6th, the conspirators decided to kill Cicero on the 7th while Catiline and other conspirators would leave the city, split up, and join the revolts. However, an informant told Cicero about their plans, and he deterred the assassins the next morning. On November 8th, he made his first speech against Catiline to the Senate, denouncing him and urging him to go into exile. Catiline did leave the city, but only to join his army. On November 9th, Cicero delivered a second speech against Catiline, this one to the people. He made the plot seem a rich man's one and not all for the people, and emphasized his own importance in saving them. Catiline and Manlius were declared public enemies. At the end of November, a conspirator tried to recruit a Gallic tribe, the Allobrogians, who weren't happy with the Romans. However, they decided the Romans were their best bet and betrayed the conspirators to Cicero. After the Gauls received incriminating letters from several conspirators still left in Rome, they handed over these documents to Cicero. On December 3rd, he used these as evidence to arrest every conspirator left in Rome. He made his third speech against Catiline, showing the evidence against the 5 conspirators to the people. On December 5th, the Senate gathered to decide the fate of the arrested conspirators. Making his 4th speech against Catiline, Cicero convinced the Senate to execute them immediately and without trial, a radical move. The order was obeyed. Cicero announced to the people, "Vixere," they are dead. When the news of the executions and the defeats of revolts around the country reached Catiline's main army, most of it deserted, making his already outnumbered force even smaller. What was left of Catiline's army traversed the country until early January 62 BC, when they finally met forces under the command of Hybrida and Legate Petreius near Pistoria. Forced to engage, Catiline fought bravely at the front, but he was killed, his army destroyed, and his cause ruined. In the end, Cicero left his term at the height of his power. However, a law was later introduced against those who killed citizens without trial, targeted at Cicero. Unable to convince the Senate he did the right thing, Cicero went into exile, and thus politics ensured that neither really won.
'I have heard Jack talk about the Kennedys, and I've been trying to think, and it's so confusing today, but I believe he disliked Bobby Kennedy.
No recollection of what he had ever said about the president.
Yes, he followed that statement up about Bobby with something about Jack Kennedy, but I can't, for the minute, just form it in my mind.
Do you think that Jack Ruby is a type of man that was capable of killing the assassin of President Kennedy out of love for Kennedy, out of political motives?
I don't think he loved Kennedy that much. I don't know why he would do it. I'd say he would be perfectly capable of an act like that, very much so.
But the reasons for it, those are hard to pin down, as the portrait of Jack Ruby emerges piece by piece.
Three-period MKUltra. Jared Lee Lochner, pictured here. If you don't know what MKUltra is, read the third paragraph. You need to so that you understand conspiracy theorist context, in referring to Lochner, the shooter in Arizona, as potential MKUltra. Well, this is weird. Lochner's attorney, who defended bomber Ted Kaczynski, also may have represented Tim McVeigh. Tim McVeigh, a lot of people don't know, was seeing the number 2 mind sciences doctor in the country ordered by the military from his years in Desert Storm. Some people, like Alex Jones, believe McVeigh was MKUltra as well. It appears Lochner was seen dazed, confused, and smiling like a lunatic after the shooting. Very similar to programming side effects, but not evidence yet. One story online shows there is a second man they are seeking for arrest in the shooting. Someone who was with Lochner right before the shooting, who was meeting with him. They have video of this man from surveillance cameras nearby. I can't say this with confidence. It appears there is enough evidence to start the rumor mill over MKUltra. I expect you will hear conspiracy theorists discussing this shooting for a while, especially if some kind of bill, law, or anti-terror act is passed quickly as a result of the trauma and tragedy. What is MKUltra? MKUltra was a code name declassified in the 1970s Church Committee and other lawsuits brought against the government, where the public was informed that thousands of people, patients from hospitals, mental health patients, prisoners, in the justice system, and even public citizens were selected for testing without their consent. Testing was conducted in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some claim they still go on today and provide evidence. The testing includes torture, drugs, and exotic hypnosis experiments in an effort to explore the mind, propaganda, and other related patterns. One subdepartment of the operation included a group of lunatic scientists who were looking to create an assassins program to see if it was possible to kidnap someone, say an enemy in a country, conduct hypnosis and other techniques learned in MKUltra, and send them back to the country with a plan to assassinate their leaders. That plan is what scares people most. MKUltra was carried out by the CIA legally, and in the 1970s, hundreds of patients sued the federal government for damages, and the government settled and paid millions of dollars. Now here is the really trippy, scary info. Some of these patients where MKUltra was used include Ted Kaczynski, Leon Abkinber, Mark David Chapman, the man who shot Lenin, Sirhan Sirhan, the man who shot Bobby Kennedy, and even Lee Harvey Oswald is rumored to have attended a base in Japan before heading to Russia, where MKUltra experiments were taking place. David Ferry, Oswald's boss for a long period of time, is said to have been an MKUltra specialist, and specialized in hypnosis, and believe it, or not, sexual molestation, to mess with his patients' heads. David Ferry was a convicted child predator who left the Catholic Church to train black operations hitmen for the invasion of Cuba. David Ferry taught the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol, where both Lee Harvey Oswald and Barry Seal joined as 15-year-old children. Barry Seal became the primary operative in Iran-Contra who ran drugs for the CIA and was an active contract hitman. Oswald was accused of killing John F. Kennedy. David Ferry was murdered, made to look like a suicide, the night before his testimony in a trial Jim Garrison brought against the CIA, where he accused Ferry and others of using Oswald as a patsy. I have tons more info on this subject matter for my film Convenient Deaths, History of Assassinations, Black Operations, and the CIA. George H.W. Bush was director of the CIA during the time many of the MKUltra cases were brought against the government. He was a major oil tycoon and skull and bonesman who was active in CIA operations before that, and after his director position at the CIA was vice president of the CIA. H.W. Bush later became president after previously sitting as vice president during the Reagan years. Many people have pointed out George H.W. Bush's connections to the Kennedy assassination. During the years Bush Sr. was involved with CIA operations against Cuba while he owned Support Oil. Lee Harvey Oswald even attended a social dinner with CIA operatives where Bush Sr. was present years before the assassination, as pointed out in many books and research by investigators. One good book that will fill you in on all this is Family of Secrets. A film that came out a few years ago attempted to show the connections of Bush Sr. to Kennedy's assassination called JFK, to which you can view here. John Hinckley Jr. and President Reagan. In 1980, Hinckley Sr. was a Texas oil man who, the records show, strove mightily to get fellow Texas oil man George H.W. Bush the Republican nomination for president. The Bushes and the Hinckley's were frequent dinner companions. And almost bewildered John Chancellor on NBC Nightly News reported the bizarre coincidence that Vice President Bush's son, Neil, and Scott Hinckley had dinner plans for March 31, 1981, now cancelled, of course. But even Chancellor failed to mention the close friendship between the assassin's father and Vice President Bush, let alone the rest of the corporate media. Here is the NBC clip that I found in archives and shared with the internet a while ago. This same clip, along with countless others, were collected for my documentary film series, Core of Corruption, where you can see them at coreofcorruption.com or newworldradareport.com, and they were also given to Jason Burmis to appear in Invisible Empire. Reports indicate that the Bush family strove mightily to keep this information from the American people. And some reports list this incredible coincidence directly linked to the assassination attempt of President Reagan as one of the most spiked stories of the last century. In other words, the brother of the shooter and the son of the vice president and their wives had their dinner date for the day after the shooting. But it really wasn't such a bizarre coincidence. Those two families were very close, but the press never focused on that critical fact, as it should have. If Reagan had died, the oilmen's interests would have been served. The weirdest part about it was that Hinckley was able to make and receive phone calls from his hotel room, but chose to walk a great distance and wait by a public payphone where he waited for contacts every day, as though it was a part of a conspiracy with co-conspirators. A very good read on the Hinckley-Bush connections is a book that came out about 20 years ago, entitled The Afternoon of March 30th. It was published as a novel in order to protect the author. This book is now more relevant than ever, and it can be obtained at http://www.nathanielbloomberg.com/bush.htm. Neil Bush, a landman for Amoco Oil, told Denver reporters he had met Scott Hinckley at a surprise party at the Bush home January 23, 1981, 9 weeks before Hinckley's brother John Jr. attempted to assassinate President Reagan, which would have elevated Bush Sr. to the presidency, and approximately 3 weeks after the U.S. Department of Energy had begun what was termed a routine audit of the books of the Vanderbilt Energy Corporation, the Hinckley Oil Company. In an incredible coincidence, on the morning of March 30th, the day of the Reagan assassination attempt by John Hinckley Jr., 3 representatives of the U.S. Department of Energy told Scott Hinckley, John Hinckley Jr.'s older brother and Vanderbilt's vice president of operations, that auditors had uncovered evidence of pricing violations on crude oil sold by the company from 1977 through 1980. The auditors announced that the federal government was considering a penalty of $2 million. This on the same day that his brother John, the youngest son of Vice President Bush's close friend, attempted the assassination. Scott Hinckley reportedly requested several hours to come up with an explanation of the serious overcharges. The meeting ended a little more than an hour before John Hinckley Jr. shot President Reagan. 2. Excerpts from an interview by Teresa Walla, United Press International, March 9, 1985. Journalism professor Nathaniel Bloomberg was so disturbed about the investigation into the attempted assassination of President Reagan that he turned his suspicions into a 377-page novel. In the afternoon of March 30th, Bloomberg blends fact and fiction in looking at the unreported connections between Hinckley's family and that of Vice President George Bush, the man who came within a heartbeat of the presidency of the United States. What time really after is the case to be officially reopened, said the Rhodes Scholar and former dean of the University of Montana Journalism School. If they can answer all the questions satisfactorily, I'll be delighted, he said in an interview. In truth, I don't think all the questions can be answered without opening up a whole new can of worms. Bloomberg's eyes is now focused on the indifference shown to what he calls the story behind the story. Bush, he said, has questions to answer in connection with the attempt. So do the FBI and the judge who presided over Hinckley's trial, according to Bloomberg. I'm not saying there was a conspiracy to assassinate Reagan, Bloomberg emphasized. I'm saying there was a conspiracy to keep significant information from the public that it has a right to know. Bloomberg asks his readers to consider his contentions that journalists were fed a barely believable story full of inconsistencies. A longtime media critic, he decided the example warranted more than a critique of press performance in a crisis. Such efforts, he said, usually go out there and die. Instead, he chose to weave his questions into a novel so it would reach a broader audience and allow him to probe problems in society and corruption in government, as well as maladies of the U.S. press. Here are some of the videos of the testimony from MKUltra survivors during court cases against the government. MKUltra victim testimony C. MKUltra victim testimony B. MKUltra victim testimony A. The CIA's Project MKUltra, Secret Human Experimentation. In the 1950s to the 1970s, the CIA Mind Control Project was aimed at finding a truth serum to use on communist spies. Test subjects were given LSD and other drugs, often without consent, and some were tortured. At least one man, civilian biochemist Frank Olson, who was working for the government, died as a result of the experiments. The project was finally exposed after investigations by the Rockefeller Commission. A short video about MKUltra from a documentary called Secrets of the CIA. 4-period Operation Mockingbird. Also, in the 1950s to 70s, the CIA paid a number of well-known domestic and foreign journalists from big-name media outlets such as Time, The Washington Post, The New York Times, CBS, and others to publish CIA propaganda. The CIA also reportedly funded at least one movie, The Animated Animal Farm, based on the novel by George Orwell. The Church Committee finally exposed these activities in 1975. In 1953, Joseph Alsop, then one of America's leading syndicated columnists, went to the Philippines to cover an election. He did not go because he was asked to do so by his syndicate. He did not go because he was asked to do so by the newspapers that printed his column. He went at the request of the CIA. Alsop is one of more than 400 American journalists who in the past 25 years have secretly carried out assignments for the Central Intelligence Agency according to documents on file at CIA headquarters. Some of these journalists' relationships with the agency were tacit, some were explicit. There was cooperation, accommodation, and overlap. Journalists provided a full range of clandestine services, from simple intelligence gathering to serving as go-betweens with spies in communist countries. Reporters shared their notebooks with the CIA. Editors shared their staffs. Some of the journalists were Pulitzer Prize winners, distinguished reporters who considered themselves ambassadors without portfolio for their country. Most were less exalted, foreign correspondents who found that their association with the agency helped their work, stringers, and freelancers who were as interested in the doing-do of the spy business as in filing articles, and, the smallest category, full-time CIA employees masquerading as journalists abroad. In many instances, CIA documents show journalists were engaged to perform tasks for the CIA with the consent of the managements of America's leading news organizations. The history of the CIA's involvement with the American press continues to be shrouded by an official policy of obfuscation and deception for the following principal reasons. The use of journalists has been among the most productive means of intelligence gathering employed by the CIA. Although the agency has cut back sharply on the use of reporters since 1973, primarily as a result of pressure from the media, some journalists are still posted abroad. Further investigation into the matter, CIA officials say, would inevitably reveal a series of embarrassing relationships in the 1950s and 1960s with some of the most powerful organizations and individuals in American journalism. Among the executives who lent their cooperation to the agency were William Paley of the Columbia Broadcasting System, Henry Luce of Time Inc., Arthur Hayes Sulzberger of the New York Times, Barry Bingham Sr. of the Louisville Courier-Journal, and James Copley of the Copley News Services. Other organizations which cooperated with the CIA include the American Broadcasting Company, the National Broadcasting Company, the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Hearst Newspapers, Scripps Howard, Newsweek Magazine, the Mutual Broadcasting System, the Miami Herald, and the Old Saturday Evening Post and New York Herald Tribune. By far the most valuable of these associations, according to CIA officials, have been with the New York Times, CBS, and Time Inc. Appropriately, the CIA uses the term reporting to describe much of what cooperating journalists did for the agency. We would ask them, "Will you do us a favor?" said a senior CIA official. "We understand you're going to be in Yugoslavia. Have they paved all the streets? Where did you see planes? Were there any signs of military presence? How many Soviets did you see? If you happen to meet a Soviet, get his name and spell it right. Can you set up a meeting for us? Or arrange a message?" Many CIA officials regarded these helpful journalists as operatives. The journalists tended to see themselves as trusted friends of the agency, who performed occasional favors, usually without pay, in the national interest. Two of the agency's most valuable relationships in the 1960s, according to CIA officials, were with reporters who covered Latin America, Jerry O'Leary of the Washington Star and Hal Hendricks of Miami News, a Pulitzer Prize winner who became a high official of the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation. Hendricks was extremely helpful to the agency in providing information about individuals in Miami's Cuban exile community. A note about Hendricks: he was the one who Seth Kantor, reporting on the JFK assassination, was told to call for background on Oswald after Oswald's arrest. Hendricks, from Miami, had all the info on Oswald's pro-Castro leafleting activities in New Orleans, details about Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union, etc. Only years later did Kantor realize the significance of a guy like Hendricks, CIA, having so much info on Oswald so soon after the assassination. The Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in the major media. William Colby, former CIA director, quoted by Dave McGowan, derailing democracy. "You could get a journalist cheaper than a good call girl, for a couple $100 a month." CIA operative, discussing the availability and prices of journalists willing to peddle CIA propaganda and cover stories. Catherine the Great, by Deborah Davis. There is quite an incredible spread of relationships. You don't need to manipulate Time magazine, for example, because there are Central Intelligence Agency people at the management level. William B. Bader, former CIA intelligence officer, briefing members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the CIA, and the media, by Carl Bernstein. The agency's relationship with the New York Times was by far its most valuable among newspapers, according to CIA officials. It was General Times' policy to provide assistance to the CIA whenever possible. The CIA and the media, by Carl Bernstein. Senator William Proxmire has pegged the number of employees of the federal intelligence community at 148,000, though Proxmire's number is itself a conservative one. The intelligence community is officially defined as including only those organizations that are members of the U.S. Intelligence Board, USIB. A dozen other agencies, charged with both foreign and domestic intelligence chores, are not encompassed by the term. The number of intelligence workers employed by the federal government is not 148,000, but some undetermined multiple of that number. Jim Haugen, Spooks. For some time I have been disturbed by the way the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. I never had any thought that when I set up the CIA that it would be injected into peacetime cloak and dagger operations. Former President Harry Truman, the 22nd of December, 1963, 1 month after the JFK assassination, op-ed section of the Washington Post, early edition.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again.
They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all. Outrageous conspiracy theories.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Beard World Order. I am your co-host, Guillermo Jimenez of TracesOfReality.com, joined as always by James Corbett, CorbettReport.com, and this month on the third mic, we've got our good friend Peter B. Collins of the Peter B. Collins Show, Processing Distortion over on BowlingFrogsPost.com. Peter, welcome. How you doing?
It's great to be with you, bearded, bespectacled gentleman, and I would add bald, but you're not there yet, Guillermo.
Almost. Might get there eventually.
You have a ways to go yet, young Padawan.
Well, it's good to talk to you. You know, I think people who are joining us in might be thinking, hey, where's Sibel Edmonds? This looks like a BFP roundtable. This is the Beard World. And actually, coincidentally, we are going to be starting that up pretty soon again. I think maybe even in the next couple of weeks. So by the time this is probably uploaded, you might be seeing a future roundtable with that as well. But anyway,
well, and let me just mention that I have not yet gone public with my comments on Sibel's new novel, The Lone Gladio. But I recently took a 3-week break. I had some long plane flights. And once I started reading it, I really, really felt fascinated by it. And it operates on many levels. I think it's an excellent novel, a spy novel that compares to many in that genre. But those of us who know her story and know the way many elements of it are woven into the novel, because, of course, if she tried to publish it as nonfiction, she would probably be gagged again, can appreciate what she exposes in the book. And so I just want to recommend it to those who are watching today, because I think it's both a good read and something that helps explore some of the inner recesses of the deep state.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel the same way. I thought it was a great read. We did an interview on TOR with Sibel a few weeks ago. I know James did a review recently on YouTube, a YouTube video on it. And no, absolutely. I think I'd want to echo what you said, Peter. I'd absolutely recommend people check this out. It's not only a good read, a good spy thriller, but it's absolutely very, very relevant. It's relevant to the discussion we're going to be having today. Actually, I wanted to open up the same way we opened up last month. Actually, I thought, why not keep it going with a link from Twitter here. I found this actually just before we started recording this a few hours ago, and it's by this is a tweet by Jonathan Shannon, I think it's pronounced, also coincidentally with The Guardian, but this is a little funny, I thought. He says, "My favorite American holiday is the annual unveiling of our new enemy." And I like the way that was phrased, and I found it very appropriate. I mean, I guess we have no shortage of those these days, and of course it's either Al Qaeda or it's ISIS or the Islamic State, or I guess I must have blinked for a moment because now we have a new one, the Khorasan group or entity or what have you. So yeah, it's hard to keep track of all our enemies these days. What do you think, fellas?
And I want to give credit to Jon Stewart's Daily Show, because one of his comedy reporters took the Khorasan new introduction and said, "Oh well, they're passé. We now have a splinter group from Khorasan called I'll Kill Ya All," and then. There is subsequently, during the report, she breaks into breathlessly update herself that I'll Kill Y'all has splintered into something to the effect of gonna F you up. And,
let's get right to the point, right? Why beat around the bush? Yeah.
I took a 3-week break and I tried to unplug, but I couldn't resist really, looking at the new product launch. And I'm not talking about the iPhone. And when Khorasan was introduced, I was like, wow, that's software that we never even heard about.
Right.
And I give credit to some good reporters who have exposed that there really isn't anything called Khorasan, that this is a concoction that comes from Langley or someplace like it.
Very much so, and they've tried to paint this as if it is, as you say, a splinter group of al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda that's popped up in Syria somehow or other. But of course, people who have looked into it, I mean, even they are claiming it consists of about 50 fighters. So apparently we are supposed to change the very fundamental fabric of our society to combat this scary new boogeyman of 50 bearded turban men. So, everyone better quake in their boots and give up any remaining civil liberties that they may have forgotten to scoop up over the past 12 or 13 years. It is ridiculous, but it is interesting how the unveiling of the annual unveiling of the enemy always takes place in September. It seems to be a September type event. So obviously a lot of psychological resonance there.
Wasn't it George Tenet or somebody back there who said, well, you don't launch a new product in August when everybody's on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this is very much
fall
like
line, right? Yeah,
it's
why
like
not?
the fall of 2002.
Yeah, and it can't mean obviously it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence, but that's what it comes off as, maybe superficially. But I mean, yeah, the build up to the bombing, the latest round of bombing of Iraq, just weeks before, and they'd been talking about it for a long time, for sure. But it really ramped up, late August, early September, leading up to the anniversary of September 11th. And it's hard for me to dismiss that as simply just a coincidence. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, no, I actually talked about this in a recent newsletter where I went back from the last 5 years and documented every September what happened. And going back to that ridiculous 9/11 Ground Zero mosque debacle that culminated around September 11th, I think 2009. And in 2010, there was some sort of elevated terror threat. In 2011, there was there was Benghazi and all of that. And it just goes back, or that was 2012 maybe. But at any rate, every single year it happens around this time. And I think, there's something to it. It's funny how these types of things never do crop up in July and August when everyone's on holiday. It always is when everyone's coming back to work. There really is some fundamental psychology being played on here, and it unfortunately continues to work on at least a portion of the populace. The portion of the populace that still bothers to tune into the mainstream media, and this is something that I've pointed out a few times in some of my recent broadcasts as well, is that we now have a record low number of people who actually trust the mainstream media, which is a good thing. It's heading in the right direction, those numbers, because obviously whatever else you think of the last couple of decades, I think that the mainstream media has proven in spades that it is absolutely nothing other than a mouthpiece for the administration or whatever group happens to be in power at this particular moment, and anyone who thinks otherwise at this point is simply delusional.
Well, and I would make the case that whether you're talking about data collection and data mining by the government, the information that people self-report in social media, or the sophisticated market research that's used by major media organizations, 9/11 continues to pop as a pivot point for this generation of Americans and how they view foreign policy. And, the security theater at the airports reinforces that you must be afraid, that, these people want to get us. And we have seen the hysteria generated by hawks in elected office, from Dianne Feinstein to John McCain and Lindsey Graham, that, we hear that there is a dozen, no, there's 100, no, there are 200 Americans who have gone to Syria to fight. Well, I heard a very inaccurate reference to John Walker Lind in that context by Gwen Ifill on the PBS NewsHour. And like many of the Americans who may have gone to Syria to fight, John Lind went to Afghanistan before September 11th. And he had volunteered for the Army of the Nation of Afghanistan, which was then controlled by Mullah Omar and that faction of the Taliban. And he certainly was not aware of the events that transpired, and certainly was not a decision maker. Nevertheless, he was tarred as the American Taliban, and now we have people invoking him in a false reference to the idea of American jihadists who hate America and therefore take up arms against us, when in fact most, if not all, of these Americans alleged to be fighting with the Sunni extremists in Iraq and Syria went there to oppose the Assad government, not to take up arms against the U.S. and its allies.
Yeah, I assume that those numbers are inflated, but I couldn't tell you for sure. But speaking of inflated numbers, I actually wanted to go back to something that you mentioned, James, back to the psychology of all this a little bit, because you mentioned something that I thought was interesting. You said that people are tuning out of the mainstream media; they're not as influenced, which I think is absolutely true. They're tuning out in droves. However, I did pick up on a couple of public opinion polls leading up to the bombing of Iraq. And so I wanted to get you guys' opinion on this. I mean, are they just making these numbers up? Are they just pulling them out of a hat? Or could they have been somewhat accurate, at least in that moment when the fear was at fever pitch? CNN was saying something crazy like 90% of Americans were under the impression that ISIS was a legitimate threat, and 70% supported the bombing, and they just seemed awfully high to me. Again, inflated a bit, or maybe that's what was an accurate reflection of American public at the time. Wanted to know what do you guys think about that?
You first, James.
Well, personally, I don't trust those types of poll numbers as far as I can throw them. But, I mean, I don't live in the States, so I don't interact with people there on a daily basis. I don't have that kind of... I mean, the people that I interact with tend to be the people who know about my website, who tend to not believe this garbage anyway. So I think I have perhaps a skewed view of what the average American thinks about this. And I'm sure there are a large number, a depressingly large number, who do buy into the fear-mongering. But having said that, I really do think the momentum is shifting away from that. And it brings to mind the fact that I remember seeing a few maybe even a month ago or more, when they were still just talking about the possibility of ramping up to some sort of bombing. And Sky News had a Twitter poll which indicated that 83% of respondents to this Twitter poll were in favor of bombing Syria and Iraq. And it was interesting. I mean, they had an infographic about that and everything all ready to go, as if it was, it's a propaganda campaign that's being led by, Murdoch and Sky News and all of these organizations. And it's so transparent when you see it for what it is. But I suppose if you were just there on Twitter, following Sky News breathlessly for the latest news, you might fall for that type of thing. So and that's what I think is insidious about these types of poll numbers, is that to a certain extent, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. Regardless of what's behind these numbers or how accurate they are, when people see them internally, subconsciously, I don't think it's a conscious process, but subconsciously people start to believe, the majority of people are in favor of this, and that does affect people's thinking. So it's a very insidious process, and I try to tune out of those types of poll numbers rather than...
Yeah, you answered my question, because that's what I thought you were going towards, was the idea that the idea of groupthink basically is that once someone sees those poll numbers, like, oh, okay, well, I guess I should be afraid, shouldn't I? And then it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy, rather. Peter, your thoughts?
Just today, and this is October 1st, ABC, Washington Post released a poll, and it shows that support for the bombing of Iraq and Syria is at about 70%. The so-called boots on the ground question still draws less than a majority. And I didn't get to the part of the poll where they did a test question on, do you support bombing Dr. Evil? But, for me, this idea of do you support bombing IS, and, they haven't fully developed the character of al-Baghdadi into a super evil, iconic figure like Noriega, Saddam, and, go on down the list, Zarqawi. But it's easy to understand how easily misled the American people are. And this is Obama's greatest skill. They've announced that finally Ghani, the former World Bank consultant, now running Afghanistan with our support, signed the deal to retain nearly 10,000 American troops there after the promised withdrawal date at the end of this year. And Obama saluted it as a great day for the Afghan-U.S. partnership. and there is no voice of any consequence in the U.S. saying, wait a minute, you promised to get all of our troops out. There were no qualifiers. There was no asterisk to that commitment. And now you're reneging on it, and there's no consequence.
Just to pick up on something that you said there in passing about Zarqawi being on that list of boogeymen, for people who haven't seen my recent podcast on who is really behind ISIS, I just want to point out once again that Zarqawi was the subject of an admitted Pentagon PSYOP program that was targeted at the American population, of course in complete contravention to all existing American laws, rules, and regulations, but what else is new? But an admitted Pentagon PSYOP operation in order to build Zarqawi up as a more important figure than he actually was, including, of course, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq group in general, which of course morphed into ISIS. So it is important to note that this creation of the boogeyman process I mean, we have actual documents at Pentagon briefing notes and quotes from General Kimmel and others who were intimately involved in this PSYOP operation, admitting it was a Pentagon PSYOP operation to make these types of people seem more important than they really were. They had their own justifications for that, but of course we all know that at least partial justification for that was just to justify the continuing, at that time, American presence in Iraq. And we would be naive to think otherwise. And once we start seeing the rollout of the propaganda campaign that's going to build Baghdadi up into the next boogeyman, I think we have to keep that documented history in mind.
And if I may, my bearded friends, I would like to acknowledge a serious mistake that I made and that I have compounded for years now. I've argued that Bush's surge in Iraq was a complete failure. And I was wrong, because they're still surging. These are the Sunnis that we called the Sunni awakening. And some of them had come out of American-controlled prisons after the de-Baathification blunder of Paul Bremer during the occupation of Iraq. And so we gave them uniforms and guns and lots of American cash, not to shoot us, and to try to pacify Anbar in particular. And I really misunderestimated, to borrow a mangled phrase, that the surge would continue to keep giving. And what we're seeing now is a true product of the Bush surge, because, you know, compounded by the failings of the Maliki government, which further marginalized the Sunnis who had been in power in Iraq. They said, you know, we're striking out on our own. And I think that, you know, really they should take credit that the so-called surge, which wasn't quite a psychological operation, but was a propaganda operation, that it really is one of the origins of the current monster that we are now pledged to slay.
But again, I mean, I think we have to situate that in its historical context as well, given the, again, the documented admissions of the Proactive Preemptive Operations Group, P2OG, which was specifically designed to, quote, launch secret operations aimed at stimulating reactions among terrorists and states possessing weapons of mass destruction, which, of course, I mean, then we get the British Special Forces operation soldiers dressed up in turbans and driving around in Iraq, planting bombs that get caught and then get busted out of jail by tanks. On the U.S. side, and then of course we have the bombing of the Golden Mosque and other such deliberately provocative acts, which time and time again can be sourced back to these covert operations that were launched, I think, as part of an ongoing operation to stimulate the exact type of ethnic and racial and religious tensions that we see driving Iraq apart at the seams right now. And we would be naive to think that that wasn't the goal all along, to split Iraq up into warring factions, to keep them at each other's throats, to keep them divided in order for, well, a number of different geostrategic purposes, but one of which, obviously, more easily controllable resources and control over the operations of the divided and fractured governments that are now increasingly becoming the real government of Iraq. I mean, I think the government of Iraq was mostly in name only for the last several years, and it's really becoming an on-the-ground reality now that it really is dividing up into three warring factions.
Yeah, and going back to how we opened up the conversation, I mean, it sounds like what you're describing is Gladio B to a T. This is what it's designed to produce. And even though I guess we don't have documented proof to show that this is exactly what's going on, just based on what we see, what we can observe, it fits the bill pretty well. And in fact, you know, it seemed like to me it was fairly obvious that the purpose of this latest aggression to go after this, you know, existential threat of that ISIS is now presenting, it seemed like the perfect sort of backdoor to once again go into Syria and overthrow Assad. And yet, lately, I've seen a couple of stories, more than a couple actually. It's a whole other narrative being built around the idea that Assad is actually welcoming these bombings. I want to get your perspective on this, gentleman. I saw a story out of Vox.com by Max Fisher. Congratulations, Assad. You successfully got the U.S. to bomb your enemies instead of you. And it goes on to sort of talk about the idea that Assad is actually on this. We're on Assad's side here, and this is a good thing for him and his government to be dropping bombs in his country. What do you guys think about that?
Go ahead, James.
Well, my take on this is, I mean, obviously there has been explicit mentions by people in the Obama administration that, of course, we're going to have to bomb both sides, to be fair. We're going to have to bomb against Assad as well. So I think that's just going to be a later stage of the strikes that we see going on, and they're already talking about that. But, I mean, the idea that this is somehow in the service of Assad, in terms of short-term strategic goals, I suppose perhaps you could see it that way. But in terms of the bigger picture, it's the question of who has funded, fostered, trained, equipped, armed, literally brought these groups into the positions that they're in. It has been the U.S. in conjunction with the Gulf states, in conjunction with Turkey, in conjunction with Israel, in conjunction with all of the groups that have been documented to have been sending in arms, funds, and training, including, of course, the now documented and admitted and exposed training camp that was operating just over the border with Jordan for the last couple of years that BoilingFrogsPost.com broke in late 2011, and the MSM finally decided to reveal to the world in the beginning of 2013, at which the CIA, in conjunction with those Gulf states and some of those other partners, were training the very fighters that, lo and behold, became the Islamic State. So, again, I mean, I think we have to see the bigger picture here. And if you look at that tiny little bit of the picture, yeah, I suppose it's in favor of Assad that now that some of these bombs are dropping on his enemies. But who put his enemies there in the first place, I think, is the more important question.
I'd offer three general comments. One is I just wrote down blowback squared. And what we're seeing is compounded blowback from the covert operations, some of which may have been successful that we probably don't know about, and many of which have failed in the last, pick your time period, 10 or 20 years. Secondly, what Obama has attempted to articulate is a fully incoherent and illogical approach to this situation. Because let's assume, just for a moment, that IS is as evil and barbaric as the propaganda makes it out to be. Well, what happens when we vanquish them with necessarily boots on the ground? It's not going to happen simply from airstrikes. But my bet is that after the November elections, Obama, a full lame duck, will do whatever he wants, and any pledges, not to put troops in, will be as well remembered as the pledges about Afghanistan. But if we're successful, then do we leave Assad in place, or do we blow him out too and create the next Libya? And can the region stand a failed state? Not for the purposes of staging terrorist attacks on the West, but just in terms of any coherence in the region. And I have argued that my big fear is that this vacuum creates a regional conflict that can widen if China and Russia really come off the sidelines in this particular fight. So my concern is that no one is talking about the true cost of this, the length of time it will take, and the what-ifs of what we do if we actually succeed. And of course, I find it hard to believe we'll succeed. These are people who are very committed, and our very response to them elevates their status and makes the whole effort, more likely to continue and more likely in an asymmetrical way to damage and degrade the true network of death here, which is coming from my taxpayer dollars.
It's funny you should say that, Peter, because actually I was listening to NPR the other day, And I forget who the person was that was being interviewed, but I think, you know what it was? It was people within the British Parliament, and they were going through the motions of a little dog and pony show to vote whether or not they should go ahead and join in on the bombing. And of course, it was the vast majority were on board. A few dissenters, but that was the argument. That was the what they were saying was that even if we accept the fact for the moment, we, the three of us, were to accept the idea that ISIS is a legitimate threat, that they are a homegrown terrorist faction or what have you. This is all on the up and up, and they're legitimately going to try and attack the United States and raise a flag over the White House or whatever they're saying these days. Even if we take that at face value, then what they were saying, and it made sense within that context, was, well, if we respond to these beheading videos, to this propaganda that they're putting out, if we go ahead and bomb them, isn't this exactly what they want? Wouldn't this, as you just said, wouldn't this build them up as opposed to bringing them down? So again, within that framework, that made sense. And it's unfortunate that that's the only voices of dissent we have within, I guess, the major political sphere. Although I suppose I can't imagine any other way that would be put forth. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. I forget where exactly I was going with that, but I think I know. I think you know rather what I was trying to say.
At least the British got something passing for debate. Our dogs and ponies don't even show up and are just looking at the polls saying, I've got to win re-election on November 4th, and this is not helpful. And so, all of the American political leaders are running away from this, further cementing the expanded powers of the executive to wage war, to launch new conflicts at will, completely unchecked, even by the financial aspect. The Republicans were also worked up about the deficit and how we can't do this, we can't do that because of the deficit. And nobody's saying you can't bomb in Syria because we can't afford it.
Exactly right. And I think the social engineers are obviously looking at this successful operation to engineer a bombing of a country that they've obviously wanted to go into for some time now. And let's just cast our mind back 1 year to the alleged chemical weapons fiasco in Syria that ended up being proven by MIT and others to have launched from rebel-held areas, not the government-held areas that was originally being used. And of course, that ended up fizzling out when there was huge amount of protest against the American involvement and British involvement in going in there on the basis of those chemical weapons claims. But then fast forward a year, and suddenly the operation is a stunning success because of this Islamic State propaganda that we've seen, basically trying to put that over on the American people. So there is a lesson that has been learned here. It's that if you try to maybe stage some sort of chemical weapons attack, something vaguely over there that we don't really know much about, people will protest. But if you put a turban boogeyman on the screen and say he's coming to get you, people will go for it. And maybe that's the fundamental difference, and something that's been learned and will probably be used in the future, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, if at first you don't succeed, try again is the motto, I suppose, that they're living by. What happened to Hands Off Syria, guys? That was a little over a year ago. That was a relatively sizable campaign given the anti-war scene in the States lately. Anyway, that was as sizable as it's gotten in quite some time, and yet a year later, everyone sort of just forgot about it once they had a boogeyman to fear.
Well, and I won't even press the limited attention span to a year. Let's go back 90 days to the Yazidis, all right? We were told that this was a humanitarian catastrophe that could not be handled by the Maliki government or anyone in the region. And no one but the U.S. could rescue these hapless people who had been driven to a barren mountain. That was the pretext that kind of paved the way for the wider attacks into Syria now. And they're all but forgotten. That whole string or meme is just now part of background noise.
Good point.
That's absolutely the case. And I want to point people to a very interesting editorial take from CBC News, of all places, by Neil MacDonald, the senior Washington correspondent for the CBC, who has been writing a series of increasingly interesting editorials lately, really going against some of the sort of mainstream interpretations of a lot of these events. And unfortunately, I can't seem to find the operative article at the moment, so I won't be able to reference it by name, but hopefully I can dig it up and put it in the show notes. But he had an interesting take about the difference between, for example, what is happening in the Congo is completely and utterly papered over in deference to what's happening in Syria, and he did an interesting contrast between the two, the responses of the Obama administration to different humanitarian crises. One that is arguably much larger in the Congo, but of course, Obama administration officials will happily appear with photo ops with the members in power in the Congo and continue to support militarily, financially, and otherwise some of the atrocities that are happening there. So once again, I mean, places like in Africa and other places that are less on the geopolitical radar can be completely and utterly basically ignored, while of course all attention is focused on the sort of boogeyman of the week. And unfortunately, that's nothing new, and it shouldn't have to be pointed out, but it still is, important to make those cases to all of these people who are suddenly claiming to be so worried about the Syrian people. But of course, again, just like Kony 2012 or any number of phenomena in recent years, we can see the public can be easily led, even based on misinformation, faulty information, incomplete information, to supporting military actions against parts of the world that they don't understand and that they have no genuine interest in. It's just sort of the flavor of the week that parades through the news, and it is really depressing to see how effective those types of campaigns can continue to be on influencing public opinion.
The other element here is the shifting definitions of barbarism that are defined by Western leaders. And I guess it's obligatory to say that I am not pro-decapitation. But a death in a war situation, the killing of a hostage, the torture of an individual leading up to their death is something that the United States is very good at. And we have increasingly employed these barbaric tactics against our presumed enemies. And yet we think somehow that we are immune to their use against our people, and that we can still summon massive outrage at the beheading of Jim Foley and some others, when Saudi Arabia, routinely beheads people as part of their authoritarian discipline. And we haven't stopped torturing people at Guantanamo. The use of this force feeding system is as barbaric, I would argue, as a slow death from torture. And we're able to summon outrage when it's properly targeted, but we have no sense of self-criticism or self-reflection in the same barbaric zone.
Yeah, not even a hint of cognitive dissonance. It's a powerful thing, this propaganda. It's funny, but that's a really good point, Peter. Yeah, you're absolutely right on. That we can do all the same thing. America doesn't torture. We don't call it torture, but when they do it, when those other guys do it, then we have to go after them because they're bad guys. They're bad people.
Well, it's not lost on me that the IS propagandists put Foley in an orange jumpsuit.
Oh, and, sure. Yeah.
They say that they waterboarded him. Whether it's true or not, they're using these tactics in ways that certainly resonate outside the United States, but are very effectively filtered when received by the homeland audience.
Should we get into that a little bit? I mean, it's probably worth discussing at least a bit. Those videos themselves, the legitimacy of the videos. I guess at this point, I'm assuming the three of us would agree that there was some amount of staging going on at the very least. And obviously, the site group and where these videos are being streaming through or coming through. This all is all very curious, because is the soft word that I can use to describe that. What do you guys think? I mean, obviously, I talked a little bit about this on a previous podcast myself, is James Foley specifically, and oh god goodness, the second name escapes me now. Maybe one of you can help me out with it. Soderov, is that close? Did I get that right? I think it's close enough, right?
Sounds about right.
Okay, let's go with that one. Well, no, with their connections to this other interesting character of Matthew Van Dyke, who's a journalist, but not really a journalist, but sometimes he's a journalist. It's all very curious, and how especially Foley had absolutely no journalistic background prior to being embedded with the U.S. Army, which is very, very unusual. So anyway, a lot of little curious things with the story. Wondering if you guys want to offer some thoughts on that.
Well, again, I mean, I think we have to understand these videos for what they are, which is an attempt to motivate and sway public opinion. I mean, regardless of whether you believe they're real or staged or what have you, they are an attempt to sway public opinion. And in that regard, they've been remarkably successful. And I think one of the sort of propagandistic ways that these videos function is, as I was listening to the Revelations Radio News podcast, and they were discussing some of the sort of effect of these videos. And one of the hosts, Tim Kilkenny, was discussing how he encountered people in his daily life that he'd tried to talk to that would approach him about the videos and say, did you see this? They've beheaded this guy. We've got to go in and get them. And he would engage them by actually saying, well, did you actually watch the video? Did you notice how, for example, they cut out, they didn't even show the beheading, and then, you know, they come back with a still picture of what we're asked to believe is the beheading, and blah, blah, blah. And when he tried to engage these people in that, they'd be like, oh, you actually watched that? You're sick. I mean, the point of these videos is that most people aren't going to seek them out. Most people aren't going to look at them. They're just going to hear the headline, oh, this guy's been beheaded, let's go get them. And that was particularly underlined in the British context by the fact that I believe it was Scotland Yard said that anyone who actually tries to look at this video may be that may be a terroristic activity.
Beheaded themselves, yeah. No.
Exactly. You may be suspicious if you're actually trying to seek out this video. So, I mean, it's remarkably effective for the vast majority of people who won't look at this, who won't look into it, who won't read past the headline. People who are, I mean, this is being aimed at the lowest sort of level of the media spectrum, which is the people who just get their news from occasional headlines or blurbs that they might see in passing on a newspaper or something like that, but people who will not look into it. And in that regard, it's remarkably effective. It doesn't even have to be remotely convincing as an actual piece of media, because most people won't even look at it.
Well, and yes, most people rely on received information and allow others to frame it for them. And for Show and Tell today, I wanted to recommend a book. It was published in 2013, but I just became aware of it recently. And it's written by a professor from Florida State named Lance DeHaven Smith. And it's called Conspiracy Theory in America. And he does a very good job of sketching, starting with the Kennedy assassination, which is the most widely accepted conspiracy theory package in recent American history, and moves forward. He's a little gingerly about some of the things he's willing to weigh in on, but to his credit, he does include 9/11 as what he calls a state crime against democracy. And by shifting the terminology from conspiracy theory, which he shows, and there's a CIA memo that introduced or launched conspiracy theory as a pejorative back in 1967, because there were too many people like me who were not accepting the word and work of the Warren Commission about the Kennedy assassination. And so at that point, they, using friendly media figures, they launched this very well thought out effort to demonize people who ask questions about conspiracies that are likely to have been spawned by our government. And so by shifting to the terminology of state crimes against democracy, it takes away this onus that is very clear. It's pretty high voltage, actually, that you cannot consider alternate theories. You cannot challenge the official narrative. You cannot express ordinary skepticism about things that are clearly untrue. And so we've created a mindset in the United States where the real dangerous groupthink is to not think at all, and to not use the powers that we have to challenge these things that are presented to us often in neat packages with slick production values. And it compounds, as I referred to earlier, this blowback squared, where, you know, we keep building sandcastles based, for example, on the mythology of 9/11.
Well, a couple of things to say in that regard. First of all, of course, you do point out to that CIA document that we will link in the show notes that in 1967, as you say, introduces the idea of using conspiracy theory as a pejorative, and others have done the LexisNexis type searches to prove that that suddenly became a very much used term in a lot of the media after that point.
And James, let me just interrupt to identify. It's CIA Dispatch 1035-960, and I can send you a link to where it appears to be available online.
Yes,
excellent,
yes.
Excellent.
And I do have that linked up on Corbett Report already, but we will put that in the show notes. But of course, that dates back to 1967. But of course, for those with a shorter attention span, again, we can prove this from much more recent events, talking about Gary Webb, who there is now a movie coming out, Kill the Messenger, talking about the Gary Webb story, breaking the story back in the 1990s of how in the 1980s, the cocaine import agency known as the CIA helped to bring in the cocaine as a way of funding their Nicaraguan Contra operations. And of course, that led to the crack epidemic. And now, of course, we do have the CIA the documents coming out proving that the CIA worked with as many as 17 different journalists to smear the name of Gary Webb and to basically call his work conspiracy theory, even though none of it was actually disproven. And in fact, internal CIA investigations and hearings that were held actually proved that, yes, so we kind of did allow some of this to go on under our noses. Oh, you know, but that was quickly swept under the rug. So again, the destruction of Gary Webb's career and ultimately his suicide by 2 gunshots to the back of the head ends up being, unfortunately, another sad reminder of how this continues to operate. And in regards to the idea of state crimes against democracy as a sort of counter to that conspiracy theory label, it's interesting to note, for people who didn't catch it, I believe back in 2010, Project Censored, or maybe it was 2011, Project Censored, including Mickey Huff and director Peter Phillips, attempted to publish an article talking about how 9/11 was a state crime against democracy. And they were attempting to do this through the auspices of something called the Institute for Policy Studies, a progressive think tank based in Washington, D.C. that had a deal to syndicate their columns in a number of different places. And it was the very first column that they had agreed to between Project Censored and the IPS. They were going to work together to publish some of these columns. The very first one they submitted was this 9/11 as a state crime against democracy article. And wouldn't you guess it, it was censored. They did not actually end up running it. So Project Censored was censored, attempting to even bring this idea to the public's attention, which shows, again, I think, how dangerous these ideas are to the existing power structure.
So I have a question for the two of you actually on this net before we go any more detailed into the actual specifics here, because I have just a general question I want to throw out to both of you and to the audience actually, because I'm actually very, very curious about this. Now that we know that the term conspiracy theory was developed by the CIA as a pejorative, that it was a very tactical sort of thing that they did, is that a phrase that we ought to disassociate from? Is that something that we ought to then perhaps subvert? I know, James, you did this famously with your 9/11 video on the subject of conspiracy theory, subverting that phrase once again and sort of turning it on its head a little bit. Not a little bit, a lot of it. But in other words, is this we talked about this a little bit also in a previous roundtable, the word truther as a pejorative? Is that something we ought to disassociate from, or claim it or subvert it, or what should the strategy be here? In other words, is that something you guys have given any thought? And also, I'd like to hear again. We always try to question the audience a little bit at the end to get their input, and this is something I'm genuinely very curious what all of you think about this. So, you guys, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I am a pretty stubborn guy, and I don't like to submit to the language abuse that others engage in. I still call myself a liberal, even though that's been out of fashion since the Reagan era. And, I don't think that you can really make it unstick. So I prefer to challenge people when they say, oh, you don't believe the official story about 9/11, you're a conspiracy theorist. And, as many people have pointed out, the package that is generally accepted is a bunch of loosely strung together conspiracy theories that don't hold water or even catch fish. And so, I think that we're not really going to open that many minds by trying to embrace it.
I fear that you are correct about that. But again, my initial reaction would be to say we should ignore it. Why adopt that terminology? Why engage with it? It is clearly just a weapon that's been implanted in people's minds. But unfortunately, it is so prevalent and so effective to get a lot of people to stop questioning or to simply stop listening to a lot of things that I think it does have to be addressed, and probably in a head-on way, which is why I think probably the most effective way of doing that is, as you point to, Guillermo, my most popular video was the one where I kind of took that label and tried to flip it on its head and show it for the absurdity that it is. And I think laughing at this can be an effective way of getting the people, the types of people who are susceptible to this phrase, getting them to actually look at it. And on that note, I guess I'll open the kimono a little bit. I'm actually working on an eye-opener that I hope to release next week. That's going to be entitled "Shut Up, Conspiracy Theorist," and we'll address this in again, hopefully a humorous and interesting way that will get people to question it. I think, unfortunately, just given what we do, it's one of the things that we have to keep returning to, because I know in my own limited experience here in Japan talking to people that not so much with the Japanese public who don't care about a lot of these events, to be honest, but with a lot of the expats that I talk to, it's something that comes up right away when you start talking about this. Oh, conspiracy theory.
Yeah. A couple of quick follow-ups regarding Gary Webb. James, you referenced the fact that journalists were recruited to take him down. And in particular, this goes back to when newspapers were actually owned by families, but the LA Times was the centerpiece of the attacks on Gary Webb, and that was still owned by the Chandler family at the time, and they were in a very ego-driven struggle with the family that owned the Mercury News. And the Mercury News was a more profitable newspaper in California at the time because Craigslist and online recruiting had not hit. And the Mercury News made fat profits every week from the job advertising placed by tech companies in the Valley. And so this was and at that time it was the Ritter family, Knight Ritter, that owned the Mercury. And the LA Times took great pleasure in trying to bring down this paper from a smaller market that was more successful and more profitable than the big old LA Times. Secondly, to Project Censored, I just wanted to share a brief anecdote. In 2006 or 2007, the media reform group called Free Press held a national conference, and they rented a booth to Project Censored. And Peter Phillips and Mickey Huff were there, and they were asking people to sign on to a petition to the claim that we were having a truth emergency, and that the media was responsible and that activists needed to take this on. And it was not secret that they were linking it to the false stories of 9/11. And so the organizers of this progressive media reform group came and just crashed down on Project Censored and said, cut this out. There's a Fox News team here. If they get a hold of this, we're all going to be painted as truthers. And these are people who I respect, and I will name names, John Nichols and Bob McChesney, both who have done great work on a number of important subjects. But when it came to this, they crumbled. They would not stand tall and even say, we don't agree with Project Censored, but we support their First Amendment right to express that. Instead, they were worried about the optics, and they shut them down.
That's the fundamental driving psychology of so much of this is the optics. It's how will this look to other people? Oh, will they be able to portray us as crazy? And that's why conspiracy theory is such an effective term, because people don't want to associate with anything that could be classed that, because they're afraid of social rejection. Exactly. Because they've been taught that these ideas are out there and they will be part of the outside group if they go with it. So it's so much, it plays on that fundamental insecurity that most people have. And it's, again, remarkably effective for that. But I guess we don't have to worry so much about the era of family-owned newspapers anymore, because we've entered the era of billionaire-owned newspapers. And billionaires won't be swayed by advertising dollars. So I guess we're in a much fairer media environment now.
No problem with that at all. Yeah.
Carlos Slim, the actual owner of the New York Times, has driven new cost-cutting there. They've announced today that 100 reporter positions will be eliminated, and you can just imagine how many stories, how many beats, how many important sources of information will no longer be accessed because of that major cutback at what is unfortunately the last big national paper in the country.
Or how many important stories like the NSA spying story they'll be able to cover up for a year for political purposes like they did back in 2005. But, oh well.
Yeah.
And on that note, that sounds like a wrap-up.
Yeah, I'm out of things to ask you guys. So, yeah, unless either of you have anything else that you'd like to add or anything, I don't know. Usually we have at least a story or two on beard-related news, but we may have fallen short on that this week again. I know I did, so no worries if you.
I totally forgot.
Yeah, so did I.
So I totally forgot. But we'll look right now. What is trending with regards to beards?
In the
Justices
meantime,
to debate prisoners' religious right to grow a beard.
Talk for
Tips
1
and
minute.
Tricks to look after your beard from the Sydney Morning Herald.
What was that?
How to grow a hipster beard by the Cherry Hill Courier Post.
That's good.
BYU students fight for the right to grow beards from Think Progress.
There you go.
Beards are such a trending topic. There's never any shortage of stories.
Well, I will say this, though. I'd, like always, like to invite the audience to send us their questions, their comments, anything else they'd like us for us to talk about. I would like to hear from them specifically on the conspiracy theory thing. I think that's really gonna inspire a lot of comments on that note. But anything else, again, you guys out there listening, have on your minds with regard to anything we talked about or anything at all for that matter, send them our way. We'll have the links to each of our contact pages on the show notes for this podcast. Peter, you had something to add?
Yeah, I ran across the room and grabbed this.
Okay.
It's gone viral, and it appeared to be originally a letter to the editor to a British newspaper. And the headline reads, "Clear as mud. Are you confused by what's going on in the Middle East? Let me explain. We support the Iraqi government in the fight against Islamic State. We don't like IS, but IS is supported by Saudi Arabia, whom we do like. We don't like President Assad in Syria. We support the fight against him, but not IS, which is also fighting against him. We don't like Iran, but Iran supports the Iraqi government against IS. So some of our friends support our enemies, and some of our enemies are our friends. And some of our enemies are fighting against our other enemies, whom we want to lose, but we don't want our enemies who are fighting our enemies to win. If the people we want to defeat are defeated, they might be replaced by people we like even less. And all this was started by us invading a country to drive out terrorists who weren't actually there until we went in to drive them out. Do you understand now?"
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. We've always been at war with Eurasia. What can I say? Anyway, again, big thanks to those of you who are out there listening and tuning in this month. We'll be back next month, of course. And as always, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Big thanks to you for doing this. Peter B. Collins, The Peter B. Collins Show, and Processing Distortion on BoilingFrogsPost.com. That's it for this time. Come back again next month here on the Beard World Order.
You should reject these voices. I want to say this to the television audience.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
You are free to do as we tell you. Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
The Beard World Order.
Ethiopia and the Bible. Shalom Rastafari. We want to touch on Haile Selassie I, Kedamawi Haile Selassie versus Leviathan versus the King of Kings.
The things you wish and find with forms of mind, for justice and for freedom's sake, for country king and right, country king and right, children of the emperor, them upon the battlefield in khaki suit, and lace up them Gideon boots. If at any means it's necessary, fighting militant true, defending Rastafari true. When I wanna fly so high, eyes go green to the sky, conquering Lion of Judah, roar on by.
Oh, children of Negusa Negest. I, children of Kedamawi, Haile Selassie. So Haile Selassie versus Leviathan. Now, I don't know how much you know about Leviathan. Right here is an interesting picture of Leviathan from, I think, a Thomas Hobbes etching or sketch and everything. And Leviathan represented England, right, or Great Britannia, the Tin Lady, and that times of the Gentiles prophecy, which the scripture speaks on, right? But there's Ethiopia in the Bible, but Ethiopia also, which has been hidden in translation. Now, there's Psalm 72, right? So let's open up the Yota so you can see this Psalm 72, which is known as the King's Psalm, right? The King's Son. It's subscribed 72, a psalm for Solomon. Give the king thy judgments, O Jah, and thy righteousness to the king's son. So let's bring up Psalm 72, one of the hidden Ethiopia references. You don't find it in the King James translation, but you find it within the royal Bible of His Majesty, or the Book of the Seven Seals. You find it within the Revised Amharic Bible of Kedamawi Haile Selassie. So as we open that up right there, let's look at this picture right here, right? His Majesty versus Leviathan, right? What is Leviathan? Okay, Leviathan has variously been described. Let's look in the dictionary for a moment, right? Let's look at the dictionary for a moment. Of course, a better, more biblical study would be more in order, but just to get a basic understanding, some of you all already know a little bit more about Leviathan. You have studied this, right? Others might just have heard the terminology, but really don't know too much about it. So Leviathan some would say is mythological, but we can see from its usage that it was used in world history, and therefore is not just a mythological name for a kind of a monster or a beast. I remember it says worshiping the image of the beast. That's connected with that particular theme. So right here we have Leviathan, right? Leviathan, according to the dictionary right here, right? Leviathan, Levi, right? We have Levi, and then we have Athen. Now, Athen, some say is Athena, is short for Athena, the goddess, or the Greek goddess of wisdom. Now, ones would say it was originally black, and, you know, it all basically was, since the black peoples, the Ethiopian peoples, are the first peoples, right? So some things probably doesn't amaze the ancient peoples because they've been there, they done that, as it was prophetically. So here's the psalm right here, right? The one, give the king thy judgments, Abitu, O Father, and thy righteousness to the king's son. It says that he shall judge the people with righteousness and thy poor with judgment. The mountains, you know, Ethiopia was protected by those holy mountains and being surrounded by mountains, as the mountains round about Jerusalem, so is Jah round about his people, right? So it says the mountains shall bring peace, salam, right? Salam to the people. And the mountains did bring peace to the ancient Ethiopian Hebrew nation, and the little hills by righteousness, in the righteousness of the King of Kings, Christ, right? Or Christ in his kingly character. He shall judge the poor of the people. He shall save the children of the needy, and shall break in pieces the downpresser, or not the oppressor, but the downpresser. I and I Rastafari say, they shall fear thee as long as the sun and moon endure throughout all generations. Hail Jah Rastafari. He shall come down like rain upon the mown grass, as showers that water the earth in his days. Now, this is the key thing right here. In his days. Now, this has a messianic implication, but it also shows us in the Rastafari revelation that it is in, right? It is in his days, right? In his days, in the days of the King of Kings, Edamawi Haile Selassie, Ethiopia and Africa knew peace, right? And knew progress, right? And knew the expectation of prophecy and the hope of prophecy when they walked in the teaching of His Majesty. But going astray, we see the last 40-something years, and we see presently the situation, and we call Africa and Ethiopia to repent. In his days shall the righteous flourish. The righteous flourish in the days of Kedamawi Haile Selassie. An abundance of peace for the righteous, so long as the moon endure. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. When we speak of him, we speak of earth's rightful ruler. They that dwell in the wilderness shall bow before him, and his enemies shall lick the dust. Now, this is the key area that I want to show you now in His Majesty's Bible, right? Along with King James Version side by side, right? Now, here's what it says right here, which I think is particularly interesting right here. It says, Befitum Ethiopia. So you see Ethiopia right there, but in the King James Bible, you see when it has right here, it has wilderness. So the word wilderness, remember Moses went in the wilderness, right? And he came back with an Ethiopian wife. So we can see that link with the wilderness here. And the more correct right? The more correct Ethiopia right here. Befitum Ethiopia Yesegdalu. Elatochum Afer Yilsalu. Afer Yilsalu. They shall lick the dust. Now remember, they shall eat the dust. This is interesting. They shall eat the dust. Right? Now, Adam was made from the dust, right? And he's called Adam, and the Adama is that reddish brown, that reddish brown. And the observation was made here, even in this picture right here. This is His Majesty, right? This is His Majesty in Jamaica, right? You can see His Majesty in Jamaica right here, and you can see the soldiers behind him. I think those are the Jamaican soldiers. You see the reddish brown. And you see His Majesty's amber complexion, as Hizkiel mentioned the amber, he who sits on that throne. I think Donnell also described him, the man of fire, right? The God-man, the man of fire, whose amber complexion, right? Sitting upon the throne of David, which is the throne of Yahweh, which is the throne of Jehovah. You see, without this knowledge, ones don't really recognize how bad. They might feel it, but how bad the situation of the world is because of the transgression against the King of Kings, against His way in Christ, right? Which has brought us presently to these very uncertain times and this like probationary time, right? This ending of a grace. See, the ending of the age of grace brings in the judgment. Now, the connection right here with Leviathan is particularly interesting, but the first thing I wanted to show you in this, right, because remember that the serpent was said to go about and to eat the people as dust. Why? And they eat Jah children, as they eat bread. Right, so Haile Selassie versus Leviathan, there's the victory right here where it speaks about Ethiopia. They that dwell in Ethiopia, but in the Haile Selassie Bible, it says Befitum Ethiopia Yesegdalu. Right, in His presence or in His face, Ethiopia, they will bow. That now fulfills Psalm 68. We have Psalm 68 and 31, where it says Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands to God. But the first part says that princes shall come out of Egypt. Now that is very, very important connection with this Torah portion right here. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Now let's go on with this particular psalm right here, Psalm 72, right? The king's judgments and the righteousness, right? The righteousness to the king's son. Now, the king's son, we have to understand the king's son. The king's son is Jesus Christos, is Yeshua. Jesus Christos is the king's son, right? And we have a particular interview of His Majesty where mystically He makes that very, very clear, but that goes beyond the interviewer at the time, but not beyond I and I as the Rastafari children. So verse 9 is important because those who dwell before Him, right? Those who dwell in Ethiopia before Him shall bow, and His enemies, the enemies of His Imperial Majesty, right, shall lick the dust, right? As a serpent would lick the dust. So we see where it begins is also where it ends. So that points to the end of Leviathan, which represents the sea peoples, and England or Britain, really white supremacy, the Anglo-American, Anglo-European, or the modern world order. Now, as we go on in this psalm, it says in verse 10, the kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. Yea, all kings shall fall down before Him. All nations shall serve Him. And we see this within the revelation of Haile Selassie, 72 nations. And then they rebel, right? For He shall deliver the needy when he crieth. the poor also, and him that hath no helper. He shall spare the poor and needy, and shall save the souls of the needy. This is why Rastafari calls him Ayani Abba, Father. He shall redeem their soul from deceit and violence, and precious shall be their blood in his sight. This is why we also had to mention, along with this, the Coral Gardens 1963 incident as well. It's important to make that particular connection, right, of those who are martyred for Rastafari, for Haile Selassie's, for the King of Kings' namesake, those martyrs of revelation, right, to remember those martyrs because their blood martyred on behalf of the King of Kings and his righteousness and his righteous cause. Their blood, the blood of the Rastafari martyrs, is precious in his sight, and he shall live. But now Babylon say that him dead, because Babylon is a liar, right? He shall live, and to him shall be given the gold of Sheba, right? The gold of Sheba. Now, it's not just speaking of the temporal gold. Remember, gold is, this is interesting too, right here, how in this particular picture right here, from the culture archives at Jablem Music, that you see that it's in that gold, right? That gold right there, right? Right? That's the gold of Sheba, the gold of Ethiopia. Prayer, or Isis, in Yeshua, Isis, also shall be made for him continually. Daily shall he be praised. Daily I praise the King of Kings, Kadamawi Haile Selassie. There shall be a handful of corn in the earth upon the top of the mountains. The fruit thereof shall shake like Libanos, like Lebanon, and they of the city of Jah city shall flourish like grass of the earth. His name, right? The name of the King of Kings, the name of Kedamawi Haile Selassie. His name shall endure forever. His name shall be continued as long as the sun. His name shall be continued, the name of the King of Kings, to be continued as long as the sun, and men shall be blessed. I as Rastafari, I as faithful Ethiopian Hebrews at home and abroad, we are blessed in the name of Kedamawi Haile Selassie. All nations shall call him blessed. But if the nations do not call Kedamawi Haile Selassie blessed, but continue to curse his name, then all nations that forget Jah, that forget God, are turned into hell. Therefore, prophecy is fulfilled. Blessed be Yahweh Elohim. Blessed be the King of Kings, I Abba Father, the God of Israel, who only doeth wondrous things. And blessed Baruch, Baruch, Baruch be his glorious name, Rastafari, forever, and make the whole earth be filled with his glory. What does the King of Kings teach, I? The King of Kings says to I, for my part, I glory in the Bible. So as we read and study and read and rise in the Bible, let us see it Haile Selassie's way. Let's not go astray after Babylon way. Let's stay in Yahweh, in Jah's way, right? And let the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen. The prayers of David, of DVD, the son of Jesse, are ended, are fulfilled. Amen and amen. Brothers and sisters, let us remember the Rastafari matriarchs, the patriarchs, the martyrs, right? Especially those martyrs, such as the Coral Garden 1963 Rastafari martyrs for his namesake. Shalom Rastafari Taina Yistalim.
Good afternoon. So then, Data is not information. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not understanding. Understanding is not wisdom. Author and astronomer Clifford Stoll. And education isn't how much you have committed to memory, or even how much you know. It's being able to differentiate between what you know and what you don't. French writer and Nobel Prize winner Anatole France. I decided to hit you with a doubleheader today. A, to give you two sides of a perspective, because those quotes come from two different places. And B, to make up for the fact that I didn't have one last time. I felt it was appropriate. So, this is what I call the math conspiracy. Dun dun dun! Alright, but no, seriously, I know that sounds ridiculous in its ominousness. Tongue twister there. But let me get into it. I'll explain. So as we all know, if the government can't be trusted, that means government-run schools cannot be trusted. So how are schools fucking us? Well, it's the first line of your indoctrination process after your own parents. So the purpose of school is to forge a person's mind to best serve the system and not to divert from the programming. So, how do you program free will? Well, you can't. You have to trick the person into making the choice you want them to make. Just like putting a rat in a maze. The rat doesn't know there is a way out of the maze. They just assume they need to make it to the next meal. It never occurred to them that maybe they should learn how to use the maze to get themselves out of the maze. Instead, they just react to the maze and get to the cheese at the other end. So, how does this apply to public education? In all my other videos, I stress to you critical thinking skills and problem solving for a reason. To force you to perceive information objectively. This is the key, objectivism. Yes, this is me telling you something that I think is the answer. It's one of the few things that I believe wholeheartedly is concrete. And to even say I believe it is wrong, because I just know it. It's something that I only ask you to try, to take a leap of faith, and if it fails you, to reject it. Sometimes there is something to faith, and that usually has to do with your first time doing something. What is life without risk? It's not life in any way, shape, or form. It's okay that there are unknowns out there. It's not okay to never solve the mystery of those unknowns. So, the key is objectivism. School gives you a subjective lesson plan. You were given a history book, and like the information of the Bible, you take it on faith that it is right. When you express any doubt in the sense it makes, you are mocked by the teachers and peers as a way of keeping us in a mental prison. I mentioned perceiving information earlier. So what is information? In its most basic form, it's data, right? By the way, I usually write these before I find the quotes. So the quote by Stoll in the beginning was quite appropriate, which is the reason why I chose it specifically. Data is a concrete form of a concept. A concept is a group of ideas. An idea's value is based on the values of the individual perceiving it. The question is, how do we know we got it right? How do we know it's real? If I said 2 plus 2 equals 4, how do you know? How do you know it? Answer that question to yourself, then answer this question. Do you know what 2 is? Literally, like what is the definition of 2? Now, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is correct, but if you don't know the right answer to why it is correct, then you are not using your own mind to know the truth. You just assume it. When you think about it, it's very much the thought process of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was in a cult. So I'm not asking you to be in a Pythagorean cult. I'm just asking you to find that one truth as of value. So, 2 is the product of a concept and another concept exactly like it, such as 2 cars, 2 chromosomes, 2 fingers. To express that there is another single concept present, you simply say 2. You know, you don't say, oh, I have 1 finger and 1 finger. You say, I have 2 fingers. Because why would you want to speak out your entire concept of I have this finger and that finger? 1 and 1. It's 2. You just say 2. And that's how it works. Unless you don't know how to count to 2. You just say I have 1 and I have 1. It's insane. So that's why we do that. So, for instance, if you see 2 red cars and 2 blue cars, you can say there are 4 cars total, because red car is a concept, blue car is a concept, and they're already in sets of 2. 4 cars altogether is true also, because you've gone into the larger concept of cars as opposed to the smaller concept of cars of a specific color. And that is why when you look at concepts through that demonstration, that you know for certain that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Those numbers are meant to be replaced with anything else, and that's how you're supposed to use that. It's a way that you frame the left hemisphere of your brain, the way your structured thinking works, and that is perfectly acceptable to build the structure of your brain, but it needs to be the right information. And it also means that you do not neglect the right hemisphere of your brain, which is what this society's problem is that it's too much of the too much of the left side of the brain, too much of rigid thinking. It's also not to be in a quote-unquote sexual context. It is the male side of the brain too, in that respect. So it's also, we're not supposed to have these thought processes separated. And there's even ancient religious texts that talk about the gods separating creation of man, of God's children, and separating them from their other halves, or some other thing. You got to look into it, but I'm going off on a huge tangent that has nothing to do with this conspiracy. So, my point is, now imagine an education system that has failed to explain math that way to you. How would you view the world you are trying to understand? It would be like reneging on the Renaissance. Eventually you would lose the ability to grasp the concepts of basic mechanics and physics or biology. You know, that is the difference between a successful education and a failed one. That's the real difference. But we sadly don't judge our school systems on how well we grasp concepts and can forge new ones. We base it on our tests, our testing system. Tests are designed to see if the student has accepted the program. The test is mandatory to gain the recognition of those who have the power to give you money for your labor. School is there to prepare you for the maze, to prepare you for the proverbial rat race. That's why they call it the rat race. It's just another metaphor for the Matrix or Plato's cave. This continues into college as well. Ever take a history class and try and bring up things you have heard about the pyramids from a conspiracy site that made sense to you, and then everyone looks at you like you're nuts. Even though, yeah, but scientifically it's proven that when the pyramids were built, they had to have been built this long ago, and etc. You can go through all the rational logic that you figured out on your own, but then all of a sudden you bring that in there, and you're crazy Uncle Jack. You know what I mean? It doesn't work. They will end up. They'll end up saying you are nuts. The slaves built the pyramids. Just like the Hebrew people who were slaves, and they had to fight for their freedom. Thus, they're throwing a little bit of that guilt in there. Guilt is a very powerful form of mind control, especially when it's fraudulent guilt. To make you feel bad about something that you have absolutely no responsibility for. You are not responsible for the suffering of other people that you yourself did not have a direct hand in. And unless if they think you had a direct hand in it, then they need to make that real to you. But you need to also be smart enough to know whether they're telling the truth or not. Because we always have to look at the faults in ourselves. But that being said, let's face reality. If we're talking specifically about how some of the ancient Egyptians in the dynastic period treated their slaves that they actually had at that point, that has nothing to do with you. Has jack shit. Other than the fact that you might be indoctrinated into part of that program, because we can get into another conspiracy about how ancient Egypt is an ongoing process in the modern day. But despite the fact that I was hinting at that, that's not what this is about. Once again, I'm going off on a tangent. Hi, people, I'm crazy. Anyway, it's funny how history books serve the story of the Bible pretty well and comfort the minds that way for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. You could also look into atomism. I'm bringing up Egypt again just because I'm always questioning the official story of history, so that's always on my mind. Or atomism, which was the first god to be god of the gods, and claimed to predate the gods and create them. The whole absolute God that we understand as God in the monotheistic faiths, the big three. This is the core philosophy of monotheism. Why was that belief system harshly rejected in Egypt? These are all important questions that we have to ask, and that we can't just sit there and say, well, it says here on page 3 of our textbook, that's why. And it's just like, okay, interesting story. Let's find out if it's real. This stuff takes time and research, and some people just think that it's not important to do the time and research. They just need trust because they have to move on to bigger and better things. Hey, listen, I'm not asking everybody to be, a huge historian, but, at the very least, you can ask some basic questions and get some basic answers. And then if you really care that much, you can probe into it. But at least, if it's important information, go for it. Because it might be some of the most important information you'll ever know in your life to shaping the way to your personal happiness. So that's what you have to do. I'm not going to answer any of those questions for you because I do have my theories and I do have my evidence that supports some very interesting theories at that. But I'm going to leave that for you and your ability to bridge concepts and know it for yourself. So, just want you to go out there and use your enlightenment well. Take care.
Hey guys, this is James LaFro with the Impossible Channel, and we're reporting to you American University of Afghanistan attacked, students and staff shelter in place. Let's take a look. This happened just now, 15 minutes ago.
That's right. Well, we first heard of this about 35 minutes ago. I actually saw a tweet from an old colleague of mine who happened to be in that university when this gunfire and explosions first started. He managed to escape, but he's tweeting that many of his friends and colleagues are still inside, and we're seeing that in other messages, one from an Associated Press photographer from about half an hour ago as well, saying that he was trapped in that building. Now, we're still waiting for more details, but this kind of attack, this kind of complex attack, is typical for a kind of Taliban, ISIS-style attack. We don't yet know who's behind this. We don't yet know if anyone has been harmed in this attack. But of course, the American university in Kabul is a target. Anything international in Kabul is a target these days. And just a month ago, an American and an Australian professor were both kidnapped there, and there has been no news of them since. So this is definitely in the eye of those who wish to disrupt the political life in Afghanistan, a likely target, if you say. And right now, we just don't know if those people have been able to get out safely. Jenna?
Kitty, thank you very much. We'll continue to follow those reports. Just want to mention as well that one of the big news items of the day yesterday was a U.S. Army soldier was killed in the Helmand province. So there's still obviously very much fighting going on. Greg, you mentioned the kidnapping as well at the same university. So a lot to watch. Kitty, thank you.
Yeah, well, this is very serious, actually, guys. Let's take a look at this other one. Well, yeah, this is just in a couple of hours ago. Oh, you heard the lady. They don't know nothing. Let's keep focused. Let's keep an eye open. American University of Afghanistan says it is under attack in Kabul. Let's take a look at what's happening there, and let's keep an eye open. Let's keep an eye open. Okay. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and see you again.
Hi guys, it is a cold, rainy day here in the formerly drought-plagued wasteland of South Austin, Texas. Somehow we didn't float away down the river last night, and so it is now Tuesday morning, May 13th, 2014, and I guess I'm not going to be able, I guess I lost my $12 an hour job today because of the inclement weather in Austin, Texas. So lucky you. That means I can bring you my wacky conspiracy theory Tuesday rant. And today I am going to take a dip, shall we say, into a subject I have probably never mentioned in my life on Humpty Dumpty Tribe, and this is the seemingly absurd theory. I don't know whether you call it a conspiracy theory, but it's certainly a close cousin. The whole theory of abiotic oil. Basically, that all of these petroleum geologists who think that oil comes from a bunch of dead dinosaurs and plankton are all crazy, and that oil actually comes from deep within the earth. It is not of biological origin, that it is, I guess, an inorganic compound coming from deep within the earth, and therefore these peak oil idiots are completely full of shit that there is a never-ending supply of oil on this planet. And so all you peak oil people are completely crazy that the oil will never run out. And I don't want to go running off on a peak oil rant again. I am on the fence about peak oil. My opinion of peak oil, it doesn't really matter much whether peak oil theory is true or not. That I believe, being an eco-Nazi, that with or without peak oil, we are going to burn ourselves up through climate change from the burning of oil long before we have to worry about peak oil. That's the way, so I don't mind being on the fence. And the idea for this rant came to me last week when I was listening to one of my all-time Humpty Dumpty tribe heroes. I'm not even going to, is it honor this man or dishonor this man by mentioning his name? It's almost not important who this guy's name is. One of my all-time heroes on Humpty Dumpty tribe who understands so much of what is going on this planet, but he just happens to be a climate change denier. He sees zero evidence that the burning of hydrocarbons releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, he claims it is complete, unadulterated horseshit. And it's not surprising that climate change deniers and, as I found out in my research for this article, evolution deniers are hopping on the abiotic oil bandwagon. I am completely embarrassed for this man and anybody else who, not so much, I really don't give a shit what they think about abiotic oil or peak oil. It's the fact that they see no evidence anywhere that the burning of oil makes any difference on this planet. And you don't even have to burn it. Just look at it. So I will get to my bottom line conclusions, not to give away the punchline, but since I realize not many people are going to understand, my bottom line and top line conclusion to abiotic oil: who gives a shit where this nasty shit comes from? I could give a shit whether this stuff, it comes from dead dinosaurs or for deep within the bowels of this planet. Talk to this pelican here. This is from the BP oil spill. Talk to these three pelicans. Ask them, guys, what is your opinion on abiotic oil? I don't really think these pelicans give a shit whether abiotic oil is a fantasy or a fact. Who cares? The shit is evil. Everything about it. It makes no goddamn difference where this shit comes from. But anyway, I think I've already jumped to the bottom line of this eco-Nazi conspiracy theorist opinions of whether or not abiotic oil is just one more unadulterated horseshit. Whether oil comes, I don't give a shit where it comes from. All right? It doesn't sway me one bit from the peak oil fence. I'm still here right on up on the peak oil fence where I was before I even dove into this subject last night. But it says as long as I've made this my rant, and giving away the punchline, I'm going to go ahead and stay here, and I'm just going, I did have 6 different things. I'm only going to go to 2, since I've given away the punchline anyway. Let's just look at 2. Obviously, whenever I start out a discussion on anything like this research, I always start out with good old Wikipedia. So what does Wikipedia have to say about abiotic oil, otherwise known as abiogenic petroleum? And I love this. 3 warnings before they even start into this article. This is pretty much giving the floor to these clowns to prove their case. The first warning: this article needs attention from an expert in geology. That is the first warning. The second one, this is a long, in-depth article as these guys state their case. Second warning: this article may be unbalanced toward certain viewpoints. Well, that's the whole point, is to give these guys a chance to air their argument. And my favorite one, particularly since Alex Jones, that mental midget, Alex Jones is one more of these abiotic oil proponents. I love it. They have a little picture of a broom saying, this article may be too technical for most readers to understand. That is exactly what it is, that even these petroleum geologists and physicists are arguing, although make no mistake about it, that the vast majority, I would say, I'm just going to take a wild guess, 99% of petroleum geologists and biophysicists completely reject the whole notion of abiotic oil. Okay, so what is all this about? Technically, the term is abiogenic petroleum origin. Is a hypothesis that was proposed as an alternative mechanism of biological petroleum origin. According to the abiogenic hypothesis, petroleum was formed from deep carbon deposits, perhaps dating to the formation of the Earth. Supporters of the hypothesis suggest that a great deal more petroleum exists on Earth than commonly thought, and that petroleum may originate from carbon-bearing fluids that migrate upward from the mantle. The presence of huge amounts of methane on Saturn's moon Titan and in the atmosphere of other planets is used as evidence of the formation of hydrocarbons without biology. And that's just one piece of cherry-picked weak evidence that I'm not going to get into deep in this article. I will put the link for any of you who think you can understand this unbalanced article. Go read it for yourself. I'm not going to spend the hour it would take for me to read this gobbledygook. Okay, the hypothesis was first proposed in the 16th century. Various hypotheses were proposed in the 19th century, mostly over there in Russia, and the hypotheses were revived in the last half of the 20th century by Soviet scientists, and finally it was redefined and made popular in the U.S. by this, I don't know, he was a professor at Cornell University named Thomas Gold, who published all his research in English. You can find out. So this Cornell University, I don't know whether he was a physicist or a petroleum engineer. He is the main guy that these proponents of abiotic oil from Alex Jones to my nameless Humpty Dumpty tribe hero who is about to get knocked off out of my hero worship. Anyway, let's see. Although the abiogenic hypothesis was accepted by many geologists in the former Soviet Union, it fell out of favor at the end of the 20th century because it never made any useful prediction for the discovery of oil deposits. The abiogenic origin of petroleum has also recently been reviewed in detail by this fellow Glaspie, who raised a number of objections, including that there is no direct evidence to date of abiotic oil. Geologists now consider the abiogenic formation of petroleum as scientifically unsupported, and they agree, this is the vast majority of petroleum geologists now agree, that petroleum is formed from organic material. However, some argue that the abiogenic theory cannot be dismissed yet because the mainstream theory still has to be established conclusively. And that is true, that they cannot 100%, these scientists cannot 100% state categorically that every drop of oil on planet Earth did come from biotic sources. And if you read this in-depth article, and they admit it, that they cannot say the one thing, this article and the several others I read last night, this is how much I have budged on my position. Until I studied this, I just figured that these abiotic oil people were complete total morons. But the one thing I did learn from my research, this fellow, my Humpty Dumpty tribe hero, told me if I would just research the subject, that I would convince myself that abiotic oil is for real. I guess what I would say now about myself that is different than before I started my research is I consider it not out of the realm of possibility that some oil on this planet may not have come from dead dinosaurs. There you go. I have been budged about 1 inch from my position, but the bottom line is, so what? But of course, you cannot have any discussion of peak oil denial, which is really what this is all about, without checking in with one of my favorite doomsday prophets, Richard Heinberg. What does Richard Heinberg say about the abiotic oil controversy? And I will put this link on because I just enjoyed what he had to say about it. So what does old doomsday prophet Richard Heinberg say about this? Okay. Let's see. He says as much as he would love to ignore this controversy, to swat this mosquito once and for all. Anyway, he reluctantly gets into this. So, once and for all, here is my take on the abiotic oil controversy. So he starts out with the gist of the situation. The debate over oil's origin has been going on since the 19th century. It sounds like since the 16th century. From the start, there were those who contend that oil is primordial, that it dates back to the Earth's origin, or that it is made through an inorganic process, while others argue that it was produced from the decay of living organisms, primarily oceanic plankton that proliferated millions of years ago and were buried under ocean sediment under fortuitous circumstances. And during the latter half of the 20th century, with advances in geophysics and geochemistry, the vast majority of scientists lined up on the side of the biotic theory. A small group of mostly Russian scientists, but including a tiny handful of Western scientists, among them the late Cornell University physicist Thomas Gold, have held out for an abiotic theory. Okay, and I guess this guy Gold spelled all this stuff out in his 1998 book, The Deep, Hot Biosphere, stirred considerable controversy among the public on the questions of where oil comes from and how much of it there is. As Gold argued that hydrocarbons existed at the time of the solar system's formation and are known to be abundant on other planets where no life is presumed to have flourished in the past. And the bottom line of this is the abiotic theory holds that there must therefore be nearly limitless pools of liquid primordial hydrocarbons at great depths on Earth, pools that slowly replenish the reservoirs that conventional oil drillers tap. And anyway, he goes on and on with this, but I'm already 19 minutes into this, and so in the last 10 minutes, but he says here in his opening statements, even if the abiotic theory does eventually prove to be partially or wholly scientific valid, and that is a rather big if, it might have little or no practical consequences in terms of oil depletion and the imminent global oil production peak. That is the situation in a nutshell as I understand it, and it is probably as much information as most readers will need or want on this subject. But if you want more, you better believe, look at this. This is Richard Heinberg shooting down the abiotic oil theory. He goes on, and this is his final comments. And good Lord, look at this. Alright, then he finally gets to the bottom line. The bottom line. The points discussed above represent a mere sampling of the issue. It would be difficult, if not impossible, for me to address all of the arguments put forward by the abiotic theorist in a brief essay of this nature. So, rather than continuing along these lines, I would prefer now to pull back from a focus on details and again emphasize the bigger picture. There is no way to conclusively prove that no petroleum is of abiotic origin. However, the assertion that all oil is abiotic requires extraordinary support because it must overcome abundant evidence. Blah, blah, blah. And then he kind of laughs at himself because he likes to cheer on the underdog, as he calls himself a scientific maverick. So, anyway, so what if oil were in fact virtually inexhaustible? Would this be good news? Not in my view. It is my opinion that the discovery of oil was the greatest tragedy in terms of its long-term consequences in human history. Finding a limitless supply of oil might forestall nasty price increases and catastrophic withdrawal symptoms, but it would only exacerbate all of the other problems that flow from oil dependency. Our use of it to accelerate the extraction of all other resources, the venting of CO2 into the atmosphere, and related problems such as loss of biodiversity. Oil depletion is bad news, but it is no worse than oil abundance. Anyway, in short, the global energy crisis is coming upon us very quickly, so that more time spent debating highly speculative theories can only distract us from exploring and applying ourselves to the practical strategies that might preserve more of nature, culture, and human life under the conditions that are rapidly developing. Thank you very much, Richard Heinberg. I'm sure these birds would agree with you that they don't give a shit where this stuff comes from. Who cares? It's evil, nasty shit. And that's my opinion of abiotic oil from this eco-Nazi conspiracy theorist. I could give a shit whether abiotic oil is true or not, and I remain right on the peak oil fence, because my conclusion of this whole thing is that we are going to send ourselves into a burning lake of fire and look like, I believe this is a puffin, if I'm not mistaken. This is what we are all going to look like as we turn this planet into a burning lake of fire by burning this shit before it ever runs out, no matter where it came from. That is the bottom line. Take a look at the bottom line, and I am done with this week's unadulterated horseshit, wacky conspiracy rant for Tuesday, May 13th, 2014. I'll see what I come up with next week. I'm done with it. Bye, guys.